In this unit, we're going to be covering the Great Depression and the New Deal. And what the New Deal is going to be Franklin Roosevelt when he becomes president. This is going to be his plan and all the programs that he creates to try to fight every phase of the Depression that he possibly can. So it is important to jot these dates down. And the first date that I want you to jot down is actually 1929. In 1929, be careful to note that this is not what caused the Great Depression. Think of it more or less as this event signaled that we were entering into the Depression. And of course, that is going to be October 29th, 1929, with the stock market crash. And the Great Depression is ultimately going to go from about 1930 to 1940, 1941. And 1941, the reason we're going to see it end right along there is because of the war production that we see in America from World War II. And that will be our next unit. And the New Deal, again, make sure, just go ahead and jot out to the side so that your mind is geared in the right direction that it needs to be. This is FDR's plan to fight the Depression. All right, kind of sloppy, but that'll work. Let's move on to our first informational slide here, and go ahead and get your highlighters. And this breaks down all of the causes of the Great Depression. Trust me, I wish that we could sum it up to one thing that caused this economic crisis, but it's actually a combination of things, which makes sense because if it was just one thing, it could have easily been fixed. But because it's such a combination and it had so many negative effects in different parts of society, we're going to see that this is actually a very complicated crisis. So one of the things that we're going to see as a cause, I highlighted it there, over speculation. And this has to do with the stock market. And in the 1920s, there was kind of this lifestyle of consumerism, of needing to buy, and things are glamorous, and everything is going so well. There's no way that things are going to turn bad. And people took that attitude and viewed the stock market kind of the same way. And over speculation is the belief that things are going to continue to rise in value. That's the definition we're going to be using in our classroom. So it says many believe that stocks we're going to highlight continue to rise. We're going to see a bull market in the 1920s where people were constantly buying stocks and investing in these companies. And what we now know is companies were also, it's called padding the books. They were making their companies look more successful than what they actually were. And that is going to encourage more people to buy stocks within their company. So there's a little bit of truth to the stock values that we see in the 1920s, but a lot of it is going to be fabricated. And so a lot of people are going to continuously buy stock. And another negative effect with that is most of them are buying stock on what's called margin, where like they borrowed money to buy the radio and the Model T and the washing machine and things in the 1920s. They're going to also start borrowing money to invest in the stock market. And then sadly, again, that date is important. October 29th, 1929, often referred to as Black Tuesday. So many people are going to sell their stocks, and selling stocks is what can cause a decrease in the value of other people's stocks. And as people start to see their values drop, they hurry up and sell, causing it to drop even faster. So to be honest with you, a lot of the stock market crash is contributed to, and I want you to write it down, it's actually contributed to fear, where a lot of people panicked, they went and sold their stock, causing the stock market to crash. Another cause of the Great Depression, and many historians and economists believe that the second one here is actually the main reason that we see this economic crisis is overproduction. In the beginning of the 1920s, it made sense for these new companies like the Model T, Henry Ford making the Model T, and the radio and washing machines to make a lot of those products because the demand was high. One thing, and this sounds kind of silly, that these companies did not think about is sometimes their products were actually too good. So when people bought these products and they were buying them very heavy in the beginning of the 1920s, well, the product isn't tearing up, it's not needing to be replaced. So now towards the end of the 1920s, we don't need as many. The demand is not as high. People have already borrowed the money and gotten the products that they've already wanted. And companies were continuing to produce these items as if the demand was still as high as it was in the beginning of the decade. So overproduction, a lot of consumers, let's just hide that, are going to stop buying the products towards the end of the 1920s. And what we're going to see in here, and I've told my classes, that when a company begins to struggle and they're not making as many sales and they've got to find places inside of their company to save money, one of the first things that companies cut are actually employees. And I want to go ahead and I think that's right here, when companies lose money, they tend to lay off workers. And this is going to be a good spot to make sure that we jot down that percentage that unemployment is going to reach at its peak during the Great Depression. And for y'all to remember, that is going to be 25%. And that is a terrible percentage when it comes to unemployment. Obviously, 1 in 4 people. So back to our highlighter, kind of mentioning, to be honest with you, if you kind of remember that throughout our curriculum, farmers pretty much struggle. You know, when tariffs are raised, farmers struggle. When we talked about the populist and how farmers were being overcharged by the railroads and things. So it's just kind of a good thing to have in your mind for this curriculum that farmers, they struggle. And so down here, farmers are actually going to be overproducing since World War I. And it made sense during World War I for them to produce a lot of goods because we needed to be feeding our soldiers that we were going to be sending off of war. We had to be keeping up with the Americans that were still back at home and food production and things like that. So, but again, kind of like other industries, farmers are going to continue to produce in high amounts after World War I, and the demand is not going to be there. And when you overproduce, it drops the value of your product. The next contribution to our, let me get a new highlighter, Great Depression is going to be that banks are going to begin to struggle. Our financial system is going to collapse. Many banks had invested money in the stock market without the knowledge of their depositors. And when the stock market crashed, banks didn't have as much money within their possession as what they were supposed to cover all of their depositors. So a lot of people are actually going to show up to the bank, and it's called a bank run. I'm going to go ahead and highlight it down here. They're going to run to the bank and they're going to demand their money. And the problem is bank is not going to have all of that money on hand. And so the people in the front of the line are probably going to get their full withdrawal. But if you were in the back of the line and the bank handed out everything that they had, your money, since it was not protected at the time and that bank closes or collapses, a bank is a business, so it goes out of business, then your money is gone. And I know that's kind of difficult to comprehend. Well, where did it go? Just understand that you didn't get your money if you were in the back of the line. So you can imagine the distrust that this is going to cause between the American people and the banking system. And so I want to go ahead and highlight that next one. Make sure you know that a lot of banks are going to go out of business, and the depositors who did not get out their money in time lost everything that they had in their account, in their savings and things. Back to pink. We also had some poor economic policies in place. And you're going to learn when we cover FDR's New Deal that FDR is going to look at how our economic system was running, and we're going to realize, man, we've got to make some changes, some permanent changes to make sure this doesn't happen again. Some of the economic policies that were in place that are going to kind of contribute to this depression is laissez-faire presidents. In the 1920s, we had Harding, Coolidge, and then at the outbreak of the Great Depression, we have Hoover, whose policy is rugged individualism. He's a hands-off kind of guy. So when this Great Depression begins, he is going to stick to his policy of hands-off, of rugged individualism. Don't rely on the government to bail you out. Get out there, get a job, get your work boots on, strap them up, and make things happen. And we're also going to see that Hoover is going to realize, as this depression worsens between 1929 and 1932, he's going to realize that approach is no longer going to work, and he's going to have to be a little bit more proactive. Something else that was in place that's going to contribute are high tariffs. We had high tariffs. That's typically a Republican thing. And the Republican presidents that we saw during the 1920s, they raised tariffs. They raised tariffs so that Americans would be buying those American products, boosting American industries and our economy. And it looked like, especially on paper, that all of that worked. But what it did, and this is so very important, is high tariffs in our country are not only going to eventually hurt our economy, but they're actually going to hurt Europe's economy as well. And that happens because when we raise tariffs in our country, the countries that we trade with and that we raised tariffs on, they did the same thing in their countries. It's called a retaliatory tariff. And we've covered that in the past unit. And so you can also call this a trade war, where we throw tariffs on them, they throw tariffs on us. And basically what happens, and I want to write this down, is it cut off international trade. So again, this not only affects the United States of America and our economy, this is going to have a major negative impact on Europe's economy as well, who, to be honest with you, has been trying to rebuild from World War I for about a decade. So, and then the last one, and this one is so very important. The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, this banking system was set up under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. It's a major contribution that we give to him, where we created 12 national banks, where typically banks are private industries, but these banks are connected to our government. And they work hand in hand with our government to try to fight inflation and deflation to keep our economy as stable as possible. So, what we're going to see, well, it did it again. Let me see. What we're going to see is the Federal Reserve in the 1920s, to encourage people to go out, borrow that money, buy the products, is they actually had interest rates really low. And that's what you want. You want a low interest rate. You're going to be more likely to borrow money. You're going to be more likely, again, to take out a loan. If the interest rate is low, that's going to be a lower monthly payment. You're not going to be paying back as much in the long run. And so a ton of people went, and it was called consumer debt. They bought on credit. And the problem is is a lot of people overwhelm themselves, and especially with all the other problems that we see now with the banks collapsing and people losing their funds, people losing their jobs because of overproduction, people losing their investment in the stock market crash. People aren't going to be able to afford these monthly payments anymore. And one other thing that it's going to cause is when interest rates are low and tons of people borrowed so much that put a lot of money out in circulation towards the end, and I'm going to write this, of the 1920s, we will have inflation. And right now, I don't know when you're watching this review video, but it's 2024, and this has become very easy to teach my students the difference between inflation and deflation, because my students know that we are experiencing inflation in this country right now. Within the last couple of years, grocery prices have jumped over 50%, if not more. Things are just more expensive, and part of that is due to inflation and actually too much money out in circulation in combination of other things. So inflation we're going to see towards the end of the 1920s, early 1930s with this Great Depression, that prices are going to be high, and it's because of inflation, but people don't have the money to pay it. And then something kind of random that I want to add, and so I'm actually going to turn my ink into black, because I have seen this in your standard, and to be honest with you, it's a little difficult to teach, but I want you to hear it, I want you to see it. And another cause of the Great Depression is something called an uneven distribution of wealth. And I just want you to understand what that means. And it's still true today. There is a major uneven distribution of wealth where the majority of money, especially back then in circulation, was with the wealthy. Now, what that means is the wealthy class that we have, which let's just make sure we understand, that is literally less than 2% of the American population. The majority of the money that was in circulation was within their possession, which leaves very limited funds for the middle and the poor class. So if you see anything about uneven distribution of wealth, just understand that the majority of the wealth lied within the hands of that wealthy 2%, which is not very many people. So going on to our next slide, you need to understand what life was like during the Great Depression, because it wasn't the same for everybody. Some people living in the cities experienced different outcomes than people living in more urban areas. So let's talk about I said that wrong. People living in the cities, which is an urban area, had a different view on this depression, and they're going to see different parts of this depression from people in rural areas. So I apologize for that mistake. Right here, we'll start with urban life, which is going to be city life. We're going to see these soup kitchens and these bread lines that a lot of churches and Christian organizations are going to start up, trying to help feed people who lost their homes and are homeless now. And so I do want to jot down a couple of these organizations for you to be familiar with, all right? So make sure you know organizations like the YMCA and the Salvation Army. And of course, just like your local churches as well. And just a little review there, if you remember, these groups also have a history of helping in a past unit. They were a part of, I'm going to go ahead and kind of write over here to the side, they were a part of the social gospel movement. We covered that in our unit with the Gilded Age and Jane Addams, how they were wanting to help the people who were struggling, and then mostly immigrants throughout the Gilded Age. But now we're going to see the same thing. They're going to want to help these people who are struggling, but it's going to be more or less the people who can't afford to feed their families and the homeless, all right? The homeless are going to kind of band together in these big cities. They're going to go to New York City. You've got Central Park. And they're going to bring any scraps they have. If their vehicles were paid for, they're going to be hauling their Model Ts to these open parks. And they're going to be creating these homeless communities. And they're going to nickname them Hoovervilles. A more official name is Shantytowns. But these Hoovervilles are, we're going to write it out to the side, homeless communities. And you can kind of see they nicknamed them Hoovervilles because I've kind of alluded to this already. They're blaming their circumstances on the president. We're also going to see a lot of hobos. This is going to be mostly men, young men, even teenage boys, and a little bit younger, to be honest with you, that are going to be jumping on illegally, by the way, like local rail systems, trying to hop from city to city, kind of taking advantage of this free transportation. Again, it's illegal, but they're hopping on these trains, going to look for work. And it was extremely dangerous for the younger boys because the older ones on these trains would kind of beat them up, because you got to remember it's kind of like a dog eat dog world out there at this point, that they're on these trains to go out and find jobs to help support themselves and their family. So if you can beat up a kid and keep him on the train where he doesn't get off, that's one less person that you're going to be competing with in finding a job. So it's very, very dangerous. Moving on to rural life, more in the country. Sadly, some people, kind of like around where I live currently, had no idea that we were even in an economic depression because they already lived such a poor lifestyle. But there's going to be in the South a lot of racial tension due to job competition, where whites are going to feel like in the South that they should have priority over what limited jobs there were. Out in the Midwest, in the Great Plains region, we're going to have the Dust Bowl. And here's a very, very important name. Then we're going to see a woman by the name of Dorothea Lange. She is specifically mentioned in your standard. You need to know her. Dorothea Lange is going to go out and take pictures of this disaster known as the Dust Bowl. One of her most famous images comes from a picture of a woman, and I believe it's her 3 children. She has a very distraught look on her face, and she is going to be one of these migrants who is going to be leaving out of this region because of how devastating these dust storms are. And speaking of migration, the ones leaving Oklahoma and Arkansas, we have Okies and Arkies. And you have to know, this is a migration pattern that we see from the Midwest. And you got to know, well, where are they going? And I want you to go ahead and highlight right here. Many of them are going to go farther west to places like California. And one of the reasons they're going to be migrating to California is because, you got to think, these are farmers. What is their skill? Well, obviously, it's farming. So they're not going to be going into the cities. There's so many people in the cities. Unemployment is at a ridiculous high, and there's not going to be any jobs there that they can possibly do. They've got to find something within their realm of skill set, which again is farming. And so there's actually some grape farms out west that are hiring, and it's not going to be very good pay. It's not going to be very good working conditions by any means. But it's a job, and it's a job that they can do. So again, these migrants, Okies and Arkies, they're going to be migrating farther west to places like California. And one attraction that they're going to have there, a pull effect, because remember, it's supposed to be good, a job, is job opportunities on these grape farms. And something else, kind of like when it rains, it pours, right? The boll weevil. The boll weevil is like a little bug. It's kind of like a correlation between a stink bug and a beetle if you look at it. But this is going to devastate the South. And the South is still heavily reliant upon a cotton crop. And the boll weevil is actually going to be able to destroy the bulb on these cotton crops even before they bloom. And so we're going to see an infestation of this bug throughout the South. And so, again, when it rains, it pours. We're already in a Great Depression. The South already kind of struggles. There's racial tension down here. And then this boll weevil is going to come in and wipe out one of our major crops that we produce in the South. So, kudos to that. And then the next one, you need to know the impact that this has on minorities, okay? Blacks, obviously, especially throughout the South, their unemployment is going to rise. They're going to be more unemployed than the average white people because of the racial tension and racism, especially through the South. And to be honest with you, kind of across the country, I don't know any other way to say it, but then to say it, the country was more concerned with hiring white men than anybody else. A lot of Mexican immigrants. This is where I tell my students, we are a little bit like the toxic ex that you have, where they decide they want you, and then they decide they don't want you, and then they want you back, and then they're done with you, so then they throw you to the curb again. Okay, that's going to be kind of our relationship between World War I and World War II, and a little bit after that we're going to see with Mexican immigrants. So during World War I, we actually had an open border, okay, between us and Mexico, where we encouraged Mexicans to cross the border and come help us, specifically during the war, grow food. That is a major skill set that a lot of these immigrants had, and we needed food, again, to feed our people at home. We needed food to feed our soldiers that we're going to be sending to Europe during World War I. And a lot of those immigrants stayed. America offered them a better life. But now they're in job positions that America thinks should not be going to immigrants, should be going to the native, not Indian, but the Native Americans, the original Americans here. And so we're going to actually see something called Mexican repatriation, where we are going to deport a lot of these Mexican immigrants. And the reason we're going to be deporting them, we're going to be deporting the ones that, I'm going to make sure we understand, a lot of them had jobs. And the reason we're going to deporting them is to open up those jobs for the American that's needing them. You'll see, again, kind of like the toxic ex, World War II is going to be breaking out in the 40s, and we're going to beg a lot of these immigrants to come to America again to do the same thing they did during World War I, and that's going to be, hey, please come back, help us grow food, we need your help. So there's that toxic ex that I was talking about. We're going to see, and a lot of my students can really relate to this, escapism. Sometimes life gets stressful. Sometimes you've got so much going on, you kind of think to yourself, like, I need something to get my mind off of these circumstances. And that is escapism, whether that's for you to go on a walk, whether that's for you to sit down and read a book, watch a movie. That's escapism. You're kind of escaping from the reality at the time. So you need to know popular forms of escapism that we see during the Great Depression. Comic books are going to become very popular. They were not very expensive, and especially comic books. I want you to make sure you understand about superheroes. And I believe that those were probably popular because most stories that have this superhero in them, like the situation throughout the comic seems kind of hopeless, and that they need somebody to come in and save everything. And the end of it, like, things are better. And I think that's just kind of something that Americans wanted to rely on, that, things can be bad, but there can be a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, of course, they didn't think like Superman or something was going to come in and fix the depression, but it's just kind of the storyline that would be more appealing than obviously reading something depressing. The next one, a lot of people, despite the economic hardships that they had, would be able to save a dime or a nickel or whatever and go to the movies. Some popular movies at the time were King Kong, Gone with the Wind, which had people gossiping because it put the first cuss word into a movie, and then The Wizard of Oz. Three very popular films at the time. And then another one that you need to make sure you're familiar with about life during the Depression is the impact that this Depression had on families. Some families came together, and we're going to see a very popular board game called Monopoly. Monopoly was created throughout the Depression, and one reason that it was created is because, you couldn't afford to go out and do a lot. Board games weren't very expensive, and so this is going to kind of help families at home have something to do, and also kind of like strengthen that family unit, being able to sit down and be together. But there is also a major negative effect where some families pulled together and worked together and fought through this depression together and strengthened their family units. Sadly, we're going to see a lot of family units be broken. And a lot of men are going to abandon their families. And I wish there was a simple answer for this. The best answer, I guess, is that a lot of these men, especially like the men who jumped on these trains, going to other locations trying to find jobs, they didn't find work and they felt like they couldn't take care of their families, and maybe it was a pride thing and they didn't want to come back home empty-handed, and so sadly, many of them didn't come back home at all. And what we're going to see is that's going to put a lot of strain on the woman, because a lot of these women who, because of their traditional roles, have always been in the house, they don't have any skill set to go out into the workforce. Also, again, the government is more concerned with hiring white men because of the gender roles. They're supposed to be the ones taking care of the household and things like that. Well, now these women who don't have the man to rely on, again, not only do they not have the skill set, it's going to be really hard for them to go out and find a job, because the jobs are going towards the white man. Excuse me. And so they're going to compete for jobs, not have very much success, and because of the lack of funds, the people who struggle the most physically, like their bodies, are going to be children. Children's health are going to be have a major negative impact because they're not going to receive the proper nutrients that they need and the vitamins and the things that they need growing, because their families simply cannot afford it. When they get sick, families couldn't afford the medical bills, so they just didn't even take them to the doctor. So a lot of children are going to struggle health-wise, physically, throughout the Great Depression, okay? Moving on over here to the next side, you have got to know how Hoover responded to the Great Depression, all right? And we've already discussed that in the beginning, his policy of, and I kind of wrote over it here, of rugged individualism, which ultimately is a laissez-faire policy. Do not look to the government. And that was very easy to have before the Great Depression, because the 1920s seemed to be going so well, the government wasn't needed. Why fix what isn't broken? Well, then when it broke and the stock market crashed and the economy progressively got worse after that, that approach just isn't going to work anymore. So he's going to actually stay true to his hands-off approach, but eventually he will realize that the government is going to need to take action. But by the time he realizes it, and this is kind of how we can sum it up, his response to the Great Depression was too little help, and it was too late at this point. One thing that he did not believe in was giving something called direct relief. And that means he did not believe these struggling families, the middle and the poor class, he did not believe in giving the money directly to them to help. He's a Republican. He believes in trickle-down economics, that you help the wealthy, you help the big businesses, and the money will trickle down, or so they believed, to the middle and the poor class. And so when he does start to help, you can see here, one thing that he does is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, where he's going to give loans. He's going to give government money out. But again, it's not going to be to the people who need it the most. The wealthy were still wealthy. They still had money. It was the middle and the poor class who were struggling the most during this depression. But if you see who this Reconstruction Finance Corporation gives loans to, they give it to big businesses and the banks. Again, with the hopes that those businesses and those banks would be able to recover and do well and hire people and give people more money, and that wealth is going to trickle down. It did not work. So it wasn't enough to help these businesses and these banks, and it definitely didn't trickle down to the people who were actually struggling in the first place. He's going to create what's called a public works project. We call it the Hoover Dam. And this is going to be a major project that is going to hire only around, I believe it was about 5,000 men total, which at this point, 5,000 jobs was good, but it was not a drop in the bucket compared to the unemployment that we see. So again, that's the reason we sum it up: too little, too late. This one, I always say bless his heart, because Hoover, I firmly believe that this man didn't wake up saying, you know what, I want to make this depression worse. But he is going to sign off on the worst tariff in American history. And it's called the Smoot, is there a typo there? The Smoot-Hawley or the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Sometimes I switch out those names. This tariff had good intentions, but it had major negative effects. The intentions were, let's raise tariffs. Let's raise tariffs to the highest point that they have ever been. And that way Americans are guaranteed to be buying from American companies. If they're buying from American companies, that's going to help our economy. But we know, we've discussed it in the past, it's not always how it works. When we raise tariffs, what do other countries do? They retaliate. They raise tariffs on us. And it winds all up. And I want you to know, this tariff, again, good intentions. He had a good heart in this. He's trying to help American businesses, but it failed. Not only did this tariff hurt us, this is going to devastate Europe as well. It pretty much literally cuts off international trade completely. Absolutely cuts it off, where we're not trading with them, they're not trading with us, and it hurts both of us. So again, I want you to go ahead and write out beside the it's supposed to be Hawley-Smoot, guys. This is the worst. This is the absolute worst tariff in American history. Worst timing, things like that. Hoover, of course, being blamed. Be familiar with the things that they nicknamed the Hoovervilles, which were the homeless communities, the shanty towns. Hoover blankets. Often the homeless would cover up with like newspapers and things like that to stay warm, and they called those Hoover blankets. And then their empty pockets that they would pull their pockets out to show that they didn't have any money, they called those Hoover flags. So you can kind of see who's getting the blame for this depression, all right? And ultimately, Hoover is in his first term. So again, bless his heart, he's getting hit very, very hard. And re-election's coming up, and he's actually going to try to get re-elected. Not saying that he had a chance in the first place, but this next incident is going to be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, is the saying. And it's called the Bonus Army Incident. And these are World War I veterans. They are going to march on Washington. And the reason they're going to march on Washington is they're actually going to be asking Congress to release a bonus that was promised to them to volunteer to fight in the war. It's not supposed to be released to them until the 1940s. And we're not in the 1940s yet. But these veterans, in their mind, they're thinking, you know what, I could use that money now. And just to clarify, the bonus that was promised to them was $1,000. But they were only asking for half. They were only wanting $500 because they understood the economic crisis and the lack of funds and things like that. They were only asking for half of that to be released to them at the time. And here's where history kind of gets lost. Hoover actually supported this. He actually supported the release of half of this promised bonus to these veterans early. He believed it could kind of help the economy. It would be money that was out there. These veterans are going to spend it. It's going to be good, right? On the other hand, Congress voted against it. And Hoover, his job is to enforce the rulings and the decisions made by Congress, made by the Supreme Court. And though he wanted these funds to be released when Congress voted against it, he's going to have to enforce that. And so a lot of the bonus marchers are going to remain in Washington. They're going to refuse to leave. They're actually going to build like a little shanty town very close by the Capitol building. And kind of how I explain it to my students is, sometimes you can see the nicest person in the world and you know they're nice, but if you want to see the ugly side of them, mess with their money, because that will definitely bring out the ugly side of these people. So these bonus marchers, many of them stayed, and they were showing up on the lawn of the Capitol building where Congress meets every day, and every day they're getting more and more and more frustrated because, again, they want their money. They want their money. They fought for their country. They want it. And so Congress actually asked the president to do something about that. Like, hey, things are starting to get a little dangerous. They're starting to get frustrated. You need to do something about it. So Hoover is actually going to bring in his military to remove these veterans, and it's a disaster, guys. U.S. military, and it's going to be led by Douglas MacArthur. He's going to be a very famous general that we see in World War II in the Pacific when we're fighting against Japan. And they're going to force the veterans to evacuate, but it's going to be ugly. The little shanty towns, they're going to be burned. Gas is going to be used. A couple of children were killed in these homeless communities. It was very, very ugly. And it was publicized. There were pictures taken of it. It was published in newspapers all across the nation with like headlines that read, this is how Hoover treats your veterans and things like that. So this was kind of just, the straw that broke the camel's back. Hoover's reputation was already struggling. And then with this bonus army incident, and even though he supported the release of the funds, how he handled the removal of these veterans was ugly, and it really ruins his reputation. And that's ultimately going to lead to his loss in the next election, and that's how we get FDR.